Martin. How are you?
Oh, very well indeed. Very well indeed. Thank you. How are you doing?
Well, I'm very happy to have you today. So for people who are listening to us, I'm Feliciea Jibson. I'm the Managing Director at FSA Limited, PACS Profile. PACS is an online assessment and profiling tool to boost your child's learning and psychosocial development. So this is what we came up with, a new words about PACS, which actually describe PACS as a fantastic psychoanalysis evaluation tool. Well, today we did say that we will continue we have 1, 2, 3 now. We are down to the 3 recordings, and it's just the purpose of us engaging in this conversation is to actually learn more about dyslexia from an authority like yourself, and to add more questions about this vision and this dimension of dyslexia in other countries, like you just mentioned. So to start with, introduce yourself and what is new.
Well, my name's Martin. I run the Dyslexia Bytes project, and at the moment I'm engaged in a number of online projects as well as workshops and presentations. So I have a couple of clients I work with. I do a few presentations even now. In fact, the number of presentations I'm doing has increased because of lockdown, because now everyone can travel the world over Zoom, can't we? So I'm also working on a number of projects. A project on ethics with a university in Germany, which is really interesting at the moment. And we've just published something in an academic journal for that, which is great. I'm also working on a couple of projects to do with education and trying to broaden education out to accommodate as many different people and as many different needs as possible. And one of the interesting things, and I think this might become relevant as we talk, is that I'm working on a project that is designed to accept that different areas around the world measure dyslexia differently. And in fact, they measure dyslexia differently for a number of different reasons. So is it possible to take all these different measurements and somehow find a Babel fish, a translation tool that will enable us to make the claim that this is how many dyslexic people there are? Because at the moment, as we can see here, if you go to somewhere like Nigeria, the number of dyslexic people has been recorded as high as 33% of the childhood population, 25% of the adult population, which says something about their view of dyslexia. If you cross the borders, the many borders to Turkey, 0.05% of the population is said to have dyslexia. In Britain, different people give different numbers again. So most standard measurements give the number of people with dyslexia as round about 10% of the population. Some give it as low as 4%, but these people tend to be looking at dyslexia as what they call a disability. And others give it as high as 20%. If you take the International Dyslexia Association's figures, the mean figure that they give is about 15%. So again, they go somewhere between 5% and 25%. The mean figure they give is 15%. And most countries measure dyslexia as round about 10 to 15% of the population. But of course, it depends. It depends on the culture you have, it depends on the orthography and the language system you have, and it depends on your definitions of dyslexia. And that's why, as you go from one nation to another nation, you don't get the same dyslexia count, as it were, the same number of people as having dyslexia. This becomes really important. So if we switch very quickly to the next image, it becomes very, very important. There is the word here, dyslexia, written in gray, and the background changes color. Now, the letters that spell the word dyslexia are all the same color, but you'll notice that as you go from one side of the strip to the other side of the strip, the letters look like they're a different color. So you compare the D at the beginning of the word with the A at the end of the word, and it looks like the D is a light colored gray and the A is a dark colored gray. The truth is they're the same color. They just look different depending on the background. And the background, therefore, is very, very important to how we understand dyslexia. So dyslexia looks different depending on the culture, depending on the language, depending on the educational background, depending on the social background. We talked once about China, for instance. Now, certain people define dyslexia purely as a phonological processing deficit. Now, that may or may not be true, but let's just assume for the sake of the argument that dyslexia is simply a phonological processing deficit. Well, that's how many people look at it in China. And in China, when you read Chinese script, different parts of your brain are working from the parts of your brain that are working when you read English script or German script or French script. And you don't phonologically process when you read Chinese script. So there is a case to say there is no dyslexia in China. But of course, many people would disagree with that. Many people would disagree with that. And so when we're looking at how many people have got dyslexia, when we're looking at, is it possible to translate one measurement of dyslexia into another measurement? It's really important. And the reason it's important is that if governments and organizations are going to seriously tackle the issue of dyslexia, then they have to understand, first of all, that they're all talking about the same thing. And secondly, that they can measure dyslexia and understand how many people have got dyslexia and what the scale of the issue is. Because if dyslexia is simply, 0.005 of the population, the government is necessarily going to give less money towards it. If there are 33% of the population with dyslexia, the government is more likely to give more money towards sorting out dyslexia. More people, more organizations are going to want to get involved, etc., etc., etc. So until we discover, first of all, a cross-cultural understanding of what dyslexia is, and second, a standard way of measuring dyslexia and translating different cultures' measurements into one standard format, then we're never going to start to get to grips with the issue. And one of the projects I'm doing is exactly that.
So is this multicultural approach here, Martin, and this standardized assessment that will go across the nation, this is terribly interesting, and I think will make a lot of difference to millions of people who are sometimes slipping through the net or undiagnosed.
It will be a game changer. Yeah, a game changer.
And will be also, I could see this multicultural approach system could be applied to other learning disabilities, or like, for instance, people on autistic spectrum. They could be differently perceived into a country, from one country to another. And as you said, recognizing this and recognizing the strengths that dyslexia people now, more people are aware about dyslexia. Is dyslexia month, is dyslexia awareness month, is dyslexia week, celebrities, but other disabilities will benefit, I believe, from this multicultural approach. And just recently, I posted one of the very popular, is going around, is about inclusion. Inclusion is not a disability issue. Inclusion is a social justice issue. And I think I absolutely agree with that. And I think this multicultural approach would be very interesting if you will share the outcomes and how do you get to this tool, standardized tool that look at who's helping you to do that, Martin?
It's a European funded project, so it's a multinational conglomerate. So it has to be. It can't be a monocultural lens through which we look at this. We have to look at it through a multicultural lens.
I think you're. I'm very honored to talk to you, and I'm thinking that you would be on driving force on this project, and having this loads of people involved and professionals and experts will help immensely.
I get very excited.
I bet you are. And ourselves, we are also very passionate about, as PAX platform, as a PAX profile, of developing skills for a successful dyslexic child. And with Dave and I, our business partner, we had a presentation that we made for a virtual international dyslexia conference run by Roger Brabant and Dyslexia Institute. So it is very interesting for people to, that they actually went quite a lot to listen to this presentation that we had on developing skills. What kind of skills? Where do we have to look at? What kind of core competencies a child should have by a certain age? And how do we look at the child developmentally? Do we look at the child developmentally? And I had a parent just recently says that my child has dyslexia, and I said, how does it relate in PACS? No, he said that most dyslexia tests, they do not test behavior. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, they'll test certain behaviors. They'll test, when we say behavior, it's very difficult to separate cognitive function from behavior, because if you have a cognitive function, that manifests itself in behavior. So in one respect, they're testing behaviors, but when we use the term more broadly, no, they don't tend to test behaviors. What they tend to test is things like coordination. They tend to test things like handedness, left hand, right hand. They tend to test lateralism. They tend to test phonological processing. And this is what I've put down here. Phonological processing is certainly deeply embedded within our understanding of dyslexia, but we have to be very careful, because what people risk doing is moving from the statement dyslexia generally involves a phonological processing deficit to dyslexia involves a phonological processing deficit to dyslexia is a phonological processing deficit. There are two invalid moves in that sort of slippery slope, and yet so many people make it. And when people test for dyslexia and they focus on phonological processing, they're missing an awful lot. They're focusing on, if you like, the mechanics of a certain part of the brain. But in order to do that, you need to have come up with, as it were, a limiting belief in the first place, that these are the parts of the brain that you're going to test and nothing else. And this is what you're going to test and nothing else. It's perfectly possible to be fluent at phonological processing and still not understand something when you read it, for instance. It's perfectly possible to be fluent at phonological processing and have cross-lateral issues. It's perfectly possible to be fluent at phonological processing and have executive function issues. And so we need to examine our own limiting beliefs of what we're examining and what we're testing for when we test for dyslexia. If all we do is test phonological processing, we're not understanding the neurology of what's happening. So phonological processing and comprehension belong in different parts of the brain, as it were. This is something that very few people really consider. So if we're teaching children to read, then phonological processing isn't enough. And dyslexia involves more than simply phonological processing. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. When people test for dyslexia, they tend to test a very narrow band of skills that are perhaps easy to measure or whatever they're doing, but they test a very narrow band of skills. And most research and most opinion these days says that actually dyslexia involves more than this narrow band of skills. And so there's a disjunct between what we're testing and what we're trying to discover.
Yes, and totally agree with what you said. And the fact that we have to look at the child holistically, and we keep saying that about looking at the child holistically, because then you will see from the perspective of communication skills, cognitive skills, information processing, executive functioning that you just mentioned, the self-regulation and social interaction, you actually see the whole picture of that child. So how that child behaves in society, how is adapted to changes, how is communicating, how is the conversation skills are going. So you're not looking at one single aspect. So I do believe that, for instance, you go for a dyslexia screening test, which we have a lot of experts and lots of dyslexia assessors around. But also, I think is important to see that there are a lot of strengths and areas to develop for the child. So for the child to actually to boost their existing skills, or at least to know where the existing skills should be according with the typical age, yeah, that then it is actually an eye-opening for a parent and is eye-opening for the professional, because we all tend to go to our our area of expertise, but we have to also to be able to see, okay, in the terms of core traits and person skills, where the child is, where the child has to go from there, and how to plan it.
And this is really key because, as you say, you can't look at somebody's cognitive processes and isolate different cognitive processes from each other. It's almost like playing a musical instrument. When you hear a chord on a guitar, you can isolate the different sounds, but it would be the wrong thing to do if you're asking what the music is. And in the same way that if you're looking at a human being, it's the wrong thing to say we're only going to look at this particular part of cognitive processing. And one of the major deficiencies of that view is that, again, let's go back to China, for instance. In China, they look at dyslexia as a phonological processing deficit. Their script doesn't demand phonological processing, certainly not in the way that our sort of Arabic alphabet demands phonological processing. And so if they're not remediating against the problems that dyslexic people might have at school, then those people with dyslexia are going to fall further and further behind, because dyslexia is more than phonological processing. It involves a whole host of other things. And so if your schooling is basically standardized for everybody, regardless of whether you have dyslexia, then you're going to fail so many children. And by the time the dyslexia becomes apparent in places like China, which is later childhood, getting on towards puberty almost sometimes, they've already fallen behind, and they've fallen far, far behind. And so the job of getting them back up to the standard we want them to be at becomes harder and harder and harder. And the schools don't have the resources, and these kids will completely fail. And that's a tragedy.
It is a tragedy. And the fact that we, one of the objectives of this talk is to increase the awareness that we do not have a multicultural standardized test that will look at dyslexia from different angles. Let's put it like that. I think would be a really interesting piece of work to see that coming through. And if that is successful for dyslexia, I believe that other conditions can be tested like that, at least to have multicultural understanding of what autism is and what attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is in different countries, and where that is accepted as a disability or not.
And not only that, if you're going to talk about sexism, then you need to have a multicultural approach to talk about sexism. If you're going to talk about racism, you need a multicultural approach to talk about racism. If you're going to talk about homophobia, you need a multicultural approach to talk about homophobia. All of these big issues, they demand something other than a monocultural approach, because if we only take a monocultural approach, then what happens is we harden the bubble that we live in, and that bubble is a very small bubble indeed. And you know, especially in issues such as racism. I mean, the irony of trying to look for racism through a monocultural bubble, through monocultural lenses, it's quite resonant. And so the whole of what we need to start doing is we need to start taking cultural differences and cultural interactions into account. What do we mean by culture? What do we mean by this culture demands this? This culture sees something as this. When we say that, are we making limiting statements about them, or are we actually trying to make understanding statements about them? And so, yeah, if we don't look at issues through this lens, then we risk basically narrowing our own viewpoint and therefore becoming unable to deal with the issues outside our own context.
Absolutely. Martin, this is, we did say that it's going to be a short discussion that we have. We would love to talk. And I would like to come back to this and in a month's time to see what other news. You have very active presence in all media channels, and we absolutely love and support and reshare the work that you do. I think it's paramount for us to collaborate, and the collaborations is only going to help us to better serve the neurodiverse community. Is not a cliche, is actually is something that we aim and we want to do at best as we can. We are thank you to all listeners, and then if they wish to approach you, they could find Dyslexia Bytes website is really interesting, and then please go and visit us. And you also have a YouTube channel, Martin?
Yes, and yes, yesterday I released a YouTube conversation with the founding member of the Nigerian Amina Dyslexia Center. And talked about all the problems that she's facing in Nigeria, and the fact that most parents don't know about dyslexia, they don't accept dyslexia, that they think it's a word that's been made up, and when you explain it to them, they say, "Well, keep that quiet." They don't want anyone else to know about it. So it's fascinating to see different countries and different cultures wrestling with this very, very issue. So yeah, please do look. There's a channel on my YouTube channel, Dyslexia Bytes, that's called Intercultural Perspectives, I think it's called. And if you have a look at that, you'll see all sorts of different cultural perspectives from, as I say, somebody who runs a school in Nigeria to somebody in England who's dealing with LGBT plus refugees coming from different cultures into England. And it's fascinating to see the breadth of the challenges that we have.
Martin, thank you so much again. Well, they could also look at our website, and we also have a YouTube channel, so go to the paxprofile.com. And this interview, well, this professional discussion, we're gonna have it on both channels, on ours and yours. Would that work?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you so much, Martin, and really wishing you a super day.
Look, I'm grateful that you've invited me along. I think what you're doing is terrific. So thank you very much indeed.